Okay, so at this point, I'm gonna start to work in the background, some definition on the background mountains. I've sort of established a palette and some value with that light blue or middle blue sort of flat color that's laid in. And at this point, I've probably mixed up about four blue tones, with some, well, I'll say cooler tones. As you can see, I use some browns and stuff like that in there, but on the palette, they're pretty cool. To work in over the blue. Now the blue, some of the blue will show through, of course. So that's why it was chosen as an underpainting. And I have reference off to the side, but I'm not really trying to paint a portrait so much, or I'm not really trying to copy the reference exactly. I'm just trying to capture sort of the essence of what I see in the reference. What makes it look the way it looks. For example, what makes the rock face look like a rock face, and usually that has to do with the edges and the texture that are created by whatever the surface is, and trying to duplicate that look more so than copying every little thing, shape for shape. So again, here on the first pass, it's a little bit of an experiment, as I lay in these trees and things. I'm kind of testing to see what, I'm hopefully getting close, but I can tell at this point that some of these highlights are a little too white. They're just a little too, I brought them up in value, but I didn't bring up the saturation. So they became tints more than a lighter color. And you'll see that I kind of work that out and work that down. Now, at this point, again, this is the stage where I'm really trying to finish, kind of lay in and finish as much as I can. But I know that the way I work and kind of constantly blending down into it, I'm probably not going to get the final finish on this pass. But I'm still trying to kind of get it as close as I can. I'm really trying to, not have anything that I have to paint out on the next round. I'll just be adding even more sharpness and clarity as I paint over. What I'm working on now will be completely dry in the next setting. So, or the next sitting, I mean. Now you can see, at this point, I have both sides of this fairly laid in now. I'm starting to get to the point where I've made a pass on it, and this, as much as it establishes the color, also helps establish the drawing a little bit, because this is handled a little more off the cuff than the figures, and again, mostly because I'm not looking for a super tight drawing that I'm going to reproduce exactly what the reference is. I'm really just trying to capture the essence of the reference. So starting in on the dragon, or going at the dragon again. Now the dragon's had a blue glaze put over the brown underpainting at this point, and this is, again, this is that stage where I'm going to try and get into this and go as close to finish as I can, with everything being wet and softening things down and kind of playing around with it as I do. But I also realize that, again, this probably isn't going to be 100% finished, just because of the nature of the wet into wet. Most of the colors are going to get affected by other colors that are on the piece, and they're just not going to stay as clean and pure as I'm going to want them in those last final couple pings and highlights and stuff that will get put on in the finish. Now, the one thing I was trying to keep in mind with the dragon, especially the head and the neck area, is that, this is a large, essentially a dark shape on a light background, if you break it down into simple value terms. And while I am conscious of, obviously trying to paint some form into this dragon. I want to keep the dragon as essentially a silhouette on the big light sky. So in doing that, the string of color I'm using, it doesn't go all the way to black and it doesn't go all the way to white. It stays as sort of a light blue, and then down into, in this case, especially with a blue element, I usually use Payne's Gray as my dark, or Payne's Gray and something mixed into it, like it may have some violet mixed into it, some kind of violet, or even alizarin crimson a little bit will push it into a violet, to more of a violet color. And, the dragons too, at this point, I don't have a sculpture for this one. So it's a little bit more trial and error when I'm working out the forms and the fins and all that too, which is another reason why it will, probably need at least one more pass, because I'm not just painting something that I'm comfortable with, that the form is right and all that kind of stuff. So I'm sort of, pulling out highlights and the shape and form as I go. Now this particular dragon also has a sort of a beard, so there's a hair texture around the chin, which is interesting. Most of this dragon head I'm using a filbert, I believe it's a number 2 filbert. And again, that lets me get pretty detailed, and I really don't want to be as super detailed in a lot of the dragon as I will be able to be in the figures. I still want to let them come forward in detail and sharpness. So, I'm purposely trying to stay away from the real small rounds and stuff when I'm working on the dragon. But you can see now that as far as the dragon goes, I have a basic value laid in, and a lot of the detail is laid in on the scales and stuff too. And while I may come back and do a little finish, it's represented well in the piece now. So I can really get in here and start all these little detail elements, like the helmets and the shoulder armor and everything that's a part of the ladies' outfits. Painting metal is always, I enjoy painting metal. For me, it's sort of an exercise in middle tones with really high highlights eventually. I sometimes tend to lay them in a little lighter than they are, but of course Frazetta was a great example of how simple and how well you can paint metal at the same time, without making it real complicated. Again, I see it as being represented as a dark, sort of a dark middle tone with some very high highlights on it. And that's what I'll wind up with eventually. It looks like I'm at this pass, it's a little lighter than what I'll wind up with. Now, of course, not most of all of these outfits have been defined by art in the past, and I'm not taking a lot of liberties in the design of anything. I'm following the Dragonlance tradition. Now the shield, this is, the shield, not only is it metallic, but it is primarily in shadow because of the angle that it is in the piece. So here's where, I'll really get a taste for, this will be sort of painting metal that's almost completely in shadow, as opposed to the helmet, which was metal that's almost completely in light. And then once I get this blocked in, I'll be able to look at those two things, and they need to look like the same texture, even though they're in different kinds of light. So it'll be a matter of then marrying that all up together. As you can see side by side, I'm laying in that shield much darker than I did the helmet. Okay, now you can see now that here's the shield has pretty much been done. The shield and that shoulder armor, and it's got a lot of nuance in it because it's a subtle shape that's mostly represented by a real small bracket of values. But those those same colors now, uh, now that I have that established, I can start to lay in this chainmail. Now, I've sort of developed a technique over the years of chainmail, and I usually block in a dark first, which I did with the underpainting brown in this particular case. But it can be done. Sometimes it can be done with cooler colors also. But it's sort of a, you're making these little C shapes. And I'm using a small round at this point. To start to establish those C shapes, start to establish the flow of the chainmail, or the perspective that the cloth would take if it was cloth. In this case, obviously it's metal. So once I get that laid in and that looks correct to me, or correct enough to move forward, then I start in with the middle highlights. Now again, this thing's going to be treated like metal in that it's essentially going to be darker middle tones with some real pings of a highlight in it somewhere. And by letting the underpainting show through, it builds something that just doesn't feel, it feels to me more realistic and natural eventually. If it gets too kind of mathematical, this two real perfect patterns, it sometimes that just doesn't feel as realistic to me. It feels more drawn if you do that. So I'm trying to find a balance between it looking like there's obviously links and patterns to the chainmail, but also little glints and gleams of things being highlighted differently here and there to give it a little more air of reality, or realism, I should say. And again, at the end, just pecking in a few highlights, really kind of playing with what form would be there. And here again, this was something I touched on earlier, is now that all of the metal is in, all of this gray steel that's represented on Tika's outfit, it all has to feel like it's the same surface and the same texture in this case. So you don't want one that's real light and one that's real dark. There is quite a bit of value swing in this thing, and you can see it on that little plated thing in front of her that's hanging off the belt also. All of these things need to feel like they're made from the same material. So that's kind of the back and forth that I'll play now, that I play with at this point. And of course, we're getting down in it, so we want to, paint in the straps, the leather straps, and this kind of stuff, because there is still a little bit of the underpainting there, but mostly things that are going to be dark brown in the final. So the underpainting is a pretty good representation of what the final will actually do. Okay, so at this stage, I've made a first run at the gold on Tika also. Because everything else that had been gold, that was represented as gold in this thing so far, was just an underpainting. So there were kind of various yellows. Now the gold around her neck is a little more refined, and we can see the palette, where you can see on Kit's stuff, it's just still a wash of yellow. I find that just to be helpful to get the white out. And as you can see, when I start working on the helmet here, that it's nice to not have the yellow wet at this point, because if anything mixed in with that dark, it would lighten it very quickly and easily. And I really want, these elements are black, so I'm really trying to keep the darks clean, I guess you could say, at this point. It always, when I paint dark elements, black elements especially, it's on the palette, sometimes the colors don't look that different from one another, and it's not until you see them in the piece. But there's really a lot of subtlety in painting dark elements like that, and you want to be careful that they don't get washed out by mixing with all of the color around it. So and this isn't just in this helmet. This is almost anything I paint that's real dark like that I want to keep sort of pure and rich feeling. it'll be nice then also when I go back to do the gold piping on the helmet and things, that will not mix in with that black either, because you know those two things mixing together a lot of times can be not what you want. You know, they can get kind of greenish sometimes because it really is a dark blue and a yellow mixing together. So it's just a way to kind of keep those colors sharp and clean. But yeah, at this point we're really down in the nuts and bolts of this thing. You know, defining the horns. And again, at this point, based on things that I have on my palette, I've kind of established what the different colors are in it, meaning that if something is going to be like this horn color, this light brownish tan color, I probably have something that I've already painted that is close to that. In this case, it's that fur color that is on all the girls' outfits. So, you know, that's what you'll hear me say, you know, the piece kind of tells you what to do. Well, at this point, those kind of things are already established in the painting. So that's what I mean by the piece now will dictate anything that's in that range. That will be the palette that I'll go with. Same with the metal, obviously. Now at this point, I took one shot at the wing, and compositionally I like the big shape of the wing cutting across behind the figures, but I wasn't happy with the anatomy, and I wanted to do more of an arm and for the dragon that you would see here. And you can see to the left at this point that there's a draw over that I did in Photoshop of what I think the anatomy of the arm would look like, you know, the elbow and the bicep and all that. Even though a lot of that falls behind the figures, I still wanted to just draw it through once to try and get the anatomy correct. And then what I'm doing here is essentially what I did in the second phase of the background painting, which is just going over that blue again, establishing some darks. I'm basically changing, you could say, or revising, you know, what that wing is doing. Now, again, I'm compositionally, I don't want the piece to change that much. I want it to be still this shape that cuts across, you know, so this is a little bit of a nuanced change, but the anatomy of the dragon is something that's pretty important in this piece. I mean, it's important in every piece, but especially given the size of the dragon in here. And now you can start to see a little more, you know, where this thing's heading. The fins, the spines in the wing sort of change direction just slightly. You know, it is a slight change, but it's big enough. It's big enough that, you know, I would have liked to normally work this out before I got to this point, but this happens. You know, sometimes wings, I've done them many times, and there are points when I feel like, well, I can just push the paint around and something will emerge from that, especially in between these spines and when I'm painting the large leathery areas. But in this case, I just didn't feel like it was working. So this was one where I retooled the anatomy a little bit in progress. But I think it just kind of shows you that, you know, everything's up for correction until you put a signature on the piece. Now I'm blocking. You can see here that by changing the silhouette of this wing a little bit, I have to go into the background color and really block it out. Now that yellow is a far more transparent color than the blue, which I can get pretty dark and opaque in the first pass. So as I'm blocking this stuff out, I am trying to get the paint down as thick as I can, but it's still transparent. So I have it loaded with Liquin, so that this is definitely going to be dry the next day, because it's going to, I mean, it sounds like house painting 101, but it's, you know, it's going to take a couple coats to get that yellow covered where the yellow is covering what was a wing before. So now here you can kind of see the rough in of the wing. And this is, we're kind of back now to, you know, if I'd have known what I was doing, getting, you know, at the beginning, this is where we would have been on the first pass or so of the dragon, but such is life. You know, at this point too, I want to just get in here and basically patch out any of the old drawing or shape of the other wing that I had, just because it's distracting at this point. So again, you know, this isn't again about getting this thing to a huge amount of finish on this pass. It's blocking in all the colors, getting the value in, and we're obviously going to make another run at going over this again to achieve the opacity that I'm looking for. And then, you know, we're obviously going to make another pass at the dragon as a whole. Here, it's just finishing in the lay-in. Again, you can see, you know, I do flip the painting quite a bit. This piece was pretty large, so I didn't flip it as much as I normally would, but just, you know, for directional brush strokes, there's no shame in this at all. The markings on this dragon are pretty unique in the belly area here. So again, we want to kind of get this laid in. And this is also as much about establishing a relationship between the neck of the dragon and the figures, you know, how some of this detail falls behind or around the heads of the girls. There's some cases where, you know, I want the detail sharper, obviously up near the head of the dragon, but as it falls behind the shoulders of the girls, you know, I may soften some of the edges or leave some of the values a little closer so that the figures themselves pop forward. Okay, so there's a pretty good, we're now we're moving forward on the dragon. Just, you know, this is just the detail game now, trying to really get in here and finish the shadow, the little scales and things like this. Hi everyone. I have something new and I hope you'll find as exciting as I do. Part of my Dragons in Nature series. I'm doing a large format, limited edition art postcard, which I promise will be in your mailbox by Christmas if you pre-order by December 10th. Again, this is part of my Dragons in Nature series, and it's just a way for me to get a dragon in your mailbox. Thank you. Okay, so now I have the dragon, you know, in to the point where I'm happy with the anatomy, and it really is just down to finishing touches and cleaning up some edges on the dragon. And I've saved going back into the sky until this point, and I'm going back in to finish the sky and just add a little more subtlety of color. It really isn't about changing anything. But I'm going to add some warmer tones into this yellow. There were some stages where the blue and the yellow mixed and got a little green. So I don't mind a little of that, but I want to counter that with some warmth, with just some additional tones here. So I'm just glazing in on top of the sky, which has clearly been dry for a few days at this point. And again, these colors are very transparent. So you're seeing some of the yellow, you know, the colors that are there are warming up because of the yellow underneath it. But this is also going to be the opportunity to more or less finish blocking out making any of the final little cleanups that need to be done because I changed that wing on the dragon. I'm working, this is a wet into dry, so I'm using the brush to blend back into the dry paint. I'm just letting the brush run out of paint and then using it to sort of feather the edges. you could work like a wet into wet by putting some medium down, but I find that the medium always makes the paint a little lighter. It just changes the color while it's wet, and when you're trying to blend into these real subtle pastel colors, I prefer not to do that because it becomes hard to judge accurately what you're winding up with, and then when they dry, they don't look the same. And again, in the background here, I'm adding a little more violet to the palette. And overall, this will really shift the color just a little bit, but it goes to show you that the initial lay-in of the sky was, it was close, but it wasn't perfect. And I'm going to change the temperature of all of that now through these glazes at the end. When I am painting these skies like this, the yellow is the most easily influenced color on the palette by some of the other things. So, I'm really trying to, I don't want to lay in a lot of this middle tone because I know that the yellow won't affect it as strongly as it affects the other things. So I'm just trying to keep that in mind as I'm moving around this thing, where I'm putting the certain value and where I want the yellow to really be bright. I'm not really putting down anything at all. And again, I should probably just reiterate that I'm sure there's some sky reference off to the side somewhere. But much like the background, I'm not trying to paint a portrait of any one sky or really mimic the reference. I'm just trying to capture the essence of it. I'm looking at certain areas of the reference and using that to create the shapes that I need to create to make the painting work and have it, for example, fall behind the dragon's head at this point. You can see that, the whole sky now has a little bit of a warmer feel, goes more towards a little bit of a red-violet. Using the color, the lay-in colors, it really pushed it a little more towards green, which was okay for a while, but it wasn't ultimately where I wanted this thing to wind up. But for the most part, once I get done with this pass of the sky will be more or less finished. Now, there's little parts of the sky where I've overpainted the dragon, and again, I'm going to go back and just do final touches on the dragon, and that'll be cleaning up any of the edges that I've overpainted. Here you can see I'm using, this is a very large watercolor brush. I've mentioned this before. It's extremely soft, and I go out of my way to keep this very, very clean. And I'm constantly wiping the paint that it's pulling off on a rag, but it's just a way to go in and soften out the brushwork a little bit, which I sort of want in this cloud. I don't always want that, but when I do, this is the approach I use. Again, I've referred to this for years as dusting the painting down. It's almost like dusting for fingerprints. But you can dust it down like that, then even go back into it and establish a few more edges if you feel like the brushwork is too obvious or too strong for any area. Okay, now here it looks like I'm not doing anything to the piece, but I'm actually brushing. I'm brushing clear Liquin onto the painting at this point, and that's going to let me really blend and work into this wing. Most of what I have on that wing, even though it looks a little rough, I'm pretty happy with the anatomy. I can at least see clearly see where the arm and the muscles and certain things are going to fall. So I really want to almost blend back into that per se, but obviously it's dry. So by laying down the clear Liquin, I'm able to blend the paint wet into wet. It just doesn't affect the layer underneath at all. The layer it obviously doesn't move. As I'm blending in these areas, I'm really I'm being much more cautious about edges. I'm really looking to kind of clean those up and move on from the dragon. And at this point, this is maybe the last pass that I'll do on this wing. Hopefully, at least that's what I'm thinking at this point. Now, if it needs more, it'll get more, but This wing is the element on the dragon that's the furthest back. So I would probably try and paint it looser than some of the elements that I really want to draw attention to. Even though it's a big element in this, so it's really not that loose, but I will let some brushwork, I'll leave that alone and not blend it down to a real soft extent. But it's also at this point where you'll see at different stages, I'll start to peck in little like scale patterns that appear here and there. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they get softened back down and then just reintegrated into the piece. I also, as I'm doing this, I keep a mirror. I have several mirrors in my studio. One's mounted on the wall directly behind me so that I can look over my shoulder and get a reverse look at the painting at any point. And I also have that little mirror that you see there on my easel that I can use. And that it's a great technique for helping to refine the drawing when you're really starting to get blind to something. You've been looking at it this way for a number of hours, and you want sort of a fresh look at it. The mirror is a great tool for that. Now, as I paint in this back wing, again, I'm pretty conscious of brush direction now, and that becomes even more of a tool when I start to establish the scale patterns. And once we get into the highlights like this, we're hopefully coming in on finish. I usually do try and work the thing up without the highest highlight. I find that the colors get less muddy that way. And then when you put the highlight in, you're not trying to blend it into the piece so much. You're really just sitting that detail on top. And there to the side, you can see that I did a Photoshop draw over of this wing. So that's what I'm looking at for reference at this point too. And when I did that, I was looking at, bat wing reference and stuff like that. So, all of this stuff, all of these imaginary elements that, wind up in the final piece, they are based in some reality, and that helps ground them. Okay, so now, on a piece like this, there's plenty to work on. If you have to wait for one thing to dry, the dragon, for example, we can always move on to other elements. And this is just a matter of basically going around. Now at this point, all of these figures they all have a lot of detail to them with all the accoutrements and stuff that each of them have. So it's a matter of going around and the pouches and belts and daggers and stuff, getting all that painted in. And again, with these figures, I shot a model, and then because obviously all of these accessories and outfits aren't something that are, that we have, that change to the reference was made in Photoshop. And I really like doing the preliminary work digitally because it's just so flexible. It's unbeatable when it comes to being able to change things around digitally. And I think we're going to show some of that more in future videos. But at this point, I'm looking at that Photoshop reference, we'll call it, the altered model shoot. For all of the detail and accessories and boots and things like that. There's also, an element of when I say concern, it's not an issue, but it's something that I think about when I'm painting, is how all of these figures lock together. I mentioned it a little bit with bracketing some of the values on the dragon where he fell behind the figures. And to a smaller degree, that's what I'll do on all of these things when it comes to like boots and feet and arms, things that fall behind another element. You have to make some decisions about what element's more important. Sometimes you'll sacrifice one for the other. So they're all the relationships that we really are getting into the nitty gritty here now. But as I'm working on Gold Moon's boot here, it got me thinking about that. The boot in the front there on her. There was more detail on that in the reference shoot, but I didn't need it. I needed it to kind of fall back behind Lorana and her cape and all that kind of thing. So it was an area of detail that got played down a little bit. And that's the decision making that we make as artists. It's far more than just rendering from photographs, especially when you're painting like imaginative realism. But I think that's the case even when you're painting realism. Painting totally from life, you're still making decisions about what to put in and what to leave out. And this is just this kind of stuff, a Gold Moon's outfit here. This is you're just putting in the time, really. I mean, you can see some of the small details around the leather of the belt, and here we are, painting in this gold medallion that's on her sash. There's not much, it really is about just putting in the time and the details with these little things here. They're important to the character. So, and again, now the gold palette at this point has been well established because I've got several things that I've painted in gold or laid in. So I really know, gold should look the same throughout the entire piece. The gold that's on her outfit should look pretty similar to the gold that's on some of the other outfits. So there's a continuity in that palette that, that just helps make everything look like it is what it should be. Now, hair can be a little tricky to paint sometimes. Something that someone said to me a long time ago, hair's kind of like painting smoke. It's usually not super, there's a few little strands that pop out at you, but you're not seeing every strand represented. It's, again, falls back to some of what I discussed about painting that chainmail. If you paint every little thing, it becomes almost artificial looking. Your eye just doesn't pick it up that way. There's certain little details that suggest what the texture is, I guess, as a whole. So that's the back and forth with painting hair that I find a challenge. Now Lorana here has a very specific hairstyle, as do most of these girls. And we're trying to get all it to be represented so that these big ponytails look like big tufts of hair, but not by painting not just getting out a 000 brush and painting a bunch of little tiny hairs. I mean, it still has to have form and shadow and all that kind of stuff to it. So with the establishment of the gold palette so well established in this piece so far, of course, her hair and all the other, Gold Moon, the other blonde in the group, are going to be, those are colors that I want to have close to that gold palette too. So while there may be some subtle variations in there, they're essentially the same palette. Hi, I'm Matt Stawicki, fancy illustrator and Dragonlance fan and artist. Dragonlance has been a big part of my career and something that's always been near and dear to my heart. I recently finished a private commission that was titled The Ladies of Dragonlance, and we will be offering through my site, mattstawickishop.com, 13 by 19 archival prints, both with and without remarked drawings on them. Pre-orders will be available until December 10th. So if you're interested and want to get in early, that's the way to do it. If you have any other questions, the answers will be, again, at mattstawickishop.com. Thanks again. See you soon. Okay, so now we're really down in the finish on the dragon, and this is just, and this wing in particular. At this point, I think you could see in that opening shot that the sky is completely done. It's been all patched in. There's no sign that there was ever any change made. And you can see here now how I'm using this the smaller filbert to start to establish just little kind of what are kind of wet highlights on the dragon, and also to establish the sense of scales overall. And you can see in that back wing, now the back wing is pretty much done at this point, but it's the scales aren't everywhere. They appear in sort of the highlights, they disappear a little in the shadows, or they may be represented by reflective light. So this is a sort of a game of inches at this point. It's the subtlety, the detail is really in there and done. We're just establishing some edges now. As I say that, of course, the big hook on the wing needs a little more work than the back portion of the wing. So I am establishing some darks in that, kind of working back and forth from one side to the other to make sure that the palette and the colors on the palette are represented on both sides of both sides of the ladies. You can kind of see how when I do lay in the it's a combination between laying in sort of a pattern of brush strokes and then sometimes just randomly hitting some things in, and usually I'm trying to be aware of direction, but what I'm not trying to do is just paint perfectly spaced out little dots and highlights. And again, the space in between in between Kit there that you see in between her legs is like the perfect example of an area that I'm not trying to spend a lot of time on. It just needs to look like the wing is there, but I don't want a lot of broken detail in there because there's already enough busyness going on with the outfit and her and everything else. So while I do want it to look like obviously a continuation of the wing behind her there, I'm keeping those shapes soft. There's no real high contrast highlight there or anything like that. So that's the kind of thing I was speaking about before with getting everything to feel like it belongs together in the same scene, or certain elements are in front of one another. I was thinking about this a little while ago, and I noticed that the Lorana's the lance hadn't been painted yet. Now it has been laid in, and you can see why I waited till the end, because even though I'm painting around it a little bit here now, I would have just obliterated it painting that wing. So there was no reason to do that until the wing was established. There's also, there's a good amount of trial and error with these scales too. Even though I've been doing these for a long time, and this sort of I approach it this way, I wind up wiping out, quite a bit more than you think to get things right. It's the eraser of oil paint. So, I don't want to suggest that it feels like you have to really know where these patterns and these little marks are going to go, because a lot of it is trial and error. And again, using the mirror is a great tool. A lot of times I'll look at something in the mirror and see something that I just am not seeing when I look at it acclimated, normally, because I'm burned out on seeing it that way. And the mirror gives me a little bit of a new peek at it, a little bit of an advantage there. Yeah, now, the head of the dragon, everything about the dragon, it looks pretty done at this point. So it's really about here all I'm doing is going in and cleaning up some of the edges where it goes into the sky. And I'm being pretty careful about that now, because the sky, I'm considering done. So I don't want to make anything, I don't want to have to go back in and correct or clean anything up at this point. And again, this is an area where the light hits the neck of the dragon here a little bit. I'll sharpen up some of the scales, but there where it falls behind Tika's helmet, I'll bracket the value down and soften some of those edges and leave them just a little less distinct, just so that her helmet and her portrait come forward a little more. Of course, I mean, I think you deal with that kind of stuff in every painting, but it's more of an issue when you have multiple figures and multiple subjective elements in a piece. Well, painting the neck too, this is another thing where, the piece kind of is telling me what to do, because I've fought with the scales enough at this point to know that I like the pattern of the scales. So all I'm really trying to do is go in and put little shadows and highlights, edges of the scales, but I'm not trying to redraw. I'm not trying to redraw the scales at this point. And the same thing, I would say much of the same thing about the face. It's really pretty done. It's like 95% of the way done. It's little edges. I don't want to have to get into mixing a sky color again or patching anything like that. That's, probably not going to be something that I can match perfectly. So by working this way, I shouldn't have to do that. And this is just, the little ping highlights again, on the fin, on the face. The anatomy of the face at this point is, I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm just trying to enhance it one more level. I'm just trying to, take it to 11. It's not about redrawing it at this point. It's just about taking it to what I view as finished. Okay, so this was another sort of thing that underwent a little more of a change than maybe you want to do at this stage of the piece, but I just wasn't happy with the way this foreground was coming along. There were certain parts of it I liked. You can see there that I have multiple pieces of reference for all different kinds of things. There's a piece there that is just more of a palette piece of reference, the way the light is hitting the rock, and then there's rocks and grass. I have a bunch of that kind of stuff. And one of the things that struck me is just the light didn't feel as convincing to me coming across the front of these rocks. So I was really trying to establish a stronger sense of sunlight and form on these things, not have them just feel like they all fall in a foreground shadow. So again, now what's there is completely dry. So and thankfully these sort of orangey yellows, they are pretty opaque colors, and they have some covering power. So I'm able to get this thing reestablished or sort of redrawn pretty well on the first pass, even though I will go back into it and again just hit a few highlights and stuff. And this is just sort of the result of what happens when you're just trying to capture the essence of the reference. Because I didn't have this so well mapped out from the beginning, sometimes you'll hit that and it'll look great the first time through, and that's wonderful when that happens. When it doesn't happen, you have to be ready to go in and make a few changes, and that's what we're doing here. Now, again, because I'm just trying to catch the essence of the rocks and the grass and that kind of stuff. I'm not painting portraits of these rocks, so I really don't need a tight drawing underneath it. I can paint just from the photographs and try and establish shapes and light patterns that work for the composition, not just copying the reference again. I needed to do what I needed to do, not always what the reference does 100%. There are usually parts of the reference that I do want to take and then parts I don't. But, one of the things that I was thinking about here, the rocks that they are standing on, that are in the background more in the center of the piece, they really look like a different palette, and that the light was really hitting them differently than these ones in the front. So now you can start to see where that looks like the same rock, the same texture that belongs in that environment. And again, that was something I was sort of alluding to about the metal. And it's anything that reappears in the piece, needs to look like the same subject or the same texture, color, chroma, all of that things. It has to have those same characteristics, whether it's in light or shadow. And now there's a continuity that's starting to develop between the foreground rocks and the background rocks. Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. And if you like these videos, please remember to like and subscribe. There'll be a lot more coming up in the future. I'd also like to remind everybody that if you'd like to get in on the Dragonlance archival prints, pre-orders will be available until December 10th. So again, thank you very much, and we'll see you guys soon.